The US was basically withdrawing from globalization starting around 2000. There's this whole argument that globalization put American workers out of work, did all these terrible things. But the fact is, while the rest of the world was opening up, US was closing down on immigration, on trade deals, on investment, everything. So I think this security aspect, which again, I think is a legitimate concern, has just fed or accelerated this process. You could use the term catalyzed if that's what you want. But it started long ago, and it runs much deeper.
You've written this incredible article about the end of China's economic miracle and the opportunity that Washington could find in this. I wanted to ask, you write about the failure of the Chinese economy to reach pre-pandemic levels despite abandoning its zero COVID policy. Some executives and workers are complaining that their company could be cut out of the global supply chain as a result. Why exactly hasn't China managed to recover?
Thank you so much for reading my article and having me on, Morgan. To me, there's obviously a lot of things. China's a huge, complex economy, as many people have been pointing out, has a lot of structural problems. It's coming out of a real estate bubble that burst. It was pretty mean to some tech gurus. But I think the underlying pattern is more important. That since zero COVID, China's average people have had in their face an example of how much arbitrary Communist Party leadership can affect their day-to-day lives. I mean, in theory, they always knew this, but for decades, wisely, the party had essentially what I call a no politics, no problem deal with the people. That if you were not protesting in Hong Kong, if you were not protesting in Tiananmen Square, you were not challenging somebody for leadership, you're an average normal person running a small business or a worker, you could go about your business and the party would not interfere with your life. There were occasionally bribes, there were things to be aware of, but your day-to-day economic life was pretty darn good. And this is a pattern we saw in earlier periods in Russia, in Venezuela, in Turkey, where autocrats make that deal initially. I think zero COVID was so draconian, putting people out of work, essentially locking down whole cities. Again, we all had some form of lockdown certainly in COVID, but in China it was far larger scale, far more extreme, far less accountable, far longer. That broke the compact. And so average Chinese are emphasizing liquid assets and safe assets over investing. They're not buying durable goods. They're not investing as much or taking loans out for small business. They're taking a bigger share of their savings into bank accounts as opposed to other forms of savings. So they're scared. And that drags down the economy. And that kept it from bouncing back after reopening.
How unhappy are we seeing the Chinese people with the state of the Chinese economy at the moment?
Obviously, it's hard to tell. You don't have, there are people who monitor WeChat and other forms of China domestic online bulletin boards and commentary. We do know that the very large scale of unemployment among young people, particularly college-age young people, is concerning a lot of people. We do know that some of the business leaders who were initially quite scared by the example made of Jack Ma and Alibaba in 2021, are now grousing a bit, and we see the party coming out and saying, no, we care about the private sector, we want to reassure you. We do know, again, people are voting with their money. They're choosing to sit tight on their money in bank accounts, in liquid assets, and not buy things. So they're not happy, it seems. But I don't think we can have a fair picture of what general unhappiness looks like in China.
We know how lucrative Chinese exports are. And if we just look at the UK, British universities are very reliant on Chinese students coming over here for the international fees that they're paying. Is kind of this decline in the Chinese economy that we're seeing, is it having a knock-on effect for other countries like the UK?
I think it's a great question, particularly in the case of the UK. And I'm a huge fan, frankly, of the fact that the UK leans into its excellent university sector and various other attractions to pull people in from China and elsewhere. And my understanding is for every full freight paying Chinese student, you're able to finance another British student, not just literally finance, but I mean, it justifies the class sizes of the facility. So this is good, and you're right, it's important. I think there's offsetting effects at the moment. There is obviously what you're saying, that people are scared, they're saving more, so they may be more reluctant. And what we've seen is both exports and imports from China have cratered over the last few months. And educational services is an import. On the other hand, and this is what I argue in my article, the more people are unhappy in China, or at least scared economically and feel the growth prospects aren't as secure, the more they're going to want to move money out, the more they're going to want to have the asset of a British or Australian or Canadian, or doesn't have to be English language, but anyway, foreign credential, for example. It's a form of diversification. It's a form of having something that the Communist Party can't take away. So I think those two competing forces right now mean there's not been that much effect on net on the UK economy, but depending how they play out, it could be significant.
You know, China's economy is rapidly aging, partially because of kind of like a backfire on the one-child policy. And then you're seeing all of these students come to the UK or, you know, go abroad to go to university, and then maybe they leave or maybe they stay here, but they're contributing to international economies, not necessarily to the Chinese economy. Pairing that with the rapidly aging, population, I mean, you maybe could see something of a brain drain happening.
I think so. I think we've seen some of that, and I think the Communist Party, whether they admit that to themselves or not, is responding to it. So there has been this enormous effort on the part of various institutions in China to pay Chinese students or scientists or engineers who have been working and studying abroad to come back to China, as well as appeal to their patriotism. There are various other efforts underway. I do think there's a dynamic with student flows, and again, I genuinely appreciate Morgan, that you're focused on that, because I think that's really important example. There is a dynamic, and the same would be true with financial flows, in my view, that the more Xi and the party try to tighten up, the more incentive people have to try to get out. We saw this through the years in Latin America. We've seen this in India under the regulatory Raj. But the other thing is the U.S. is blowing it. The U.S. is, whether deliberately or not, I think under Trump deliberately, I think under Biden less deliberately, but still consistently, demonizing Chinese students. I mean, there's clearly in Congress, the elected legislatures, huge fear of and disdain for Chinese students and scientists. They're seen as a huge security threat. Similarly, Chinese investors in the U.S. The president just announced restrictions on outward flows, but I'm actually more concerned about the inward flows. And there's a lot of resentment. Oh, they're taking things over. Oh, they're stealing intellectual property. Some of that's true, but that doesn't mean that cutting off inflows is the right way to go. Anyway, the upshot is, if you're talking about the UK and some other economies, Singapore, Indonesia, as well as some of the other Commonwealth economies we talked about, they have an advantage, and they can take in a lot of the stuff that feels unwelcome in the U.S.
And I do want to talk about the U.S. in a moment, but first I wanted to ask about, you kind of refer to this phenomenon that we're seeing in the Chinese economy as economic long COVID. How long do you think this illness is going to last? I mean, you referenced, Russia and, Venezuela. Do you think that China could bounce back from it, or do you think that maybe they won't be able to stay as a superpower?
I think they will stay as a superpower for a long time, and their ability to project power in the military sphere is obvious, and their nuclear power. I mean, so there are a lot of reasons why, once we start talking about power, this doesn't mean it goes away. But I think in terms of the economic long COVID, it is potentially a several-year process, or persistent process. In my view, there are things an autocrat can do to offset when you get to this point. So after you've done the no politics, no problem, and then you've taken that away and people are scared, you can still have other levers. So like in Russia, Putin was very smart about how he used his energy revenues in husbanding them and giving to the pensions and buying people off. He was very smart in the way he managed that up to the last year and a half. In Hungary, Orban has been very smart about extracting extra money from the EU. Again, I'm not approving of Putin or Orban, but I'm just saying in economic terms. And these are things that then cause growth and can offset. But reversing the actual underlying syndrome, if I can use that word, is much harder because it means the autocrat has to credibly commit, no, I'm not going to do again what I did during COVID, or I'm only going to do it in case of a pandemic. And that's fine, but you can't trust the autocrat to do that. I mean, once people are woken up, maybe over several years, and this is how it eventually goes away, over several years, the memory of this, just like the memory of the Cultural Revolution for their grandparents, fades. But you're not going to trust, in an economic sense, voting with your money and your feet and your investments, you're not going to trust the promises of the autocrat, of the Chinese Communist Party. I'm not going to interfere. I mean, well, you might.
We saw Xi Jinping, he was reelected kind of off of the back of all of this. I mean, if, you've described in this article kind of a widespread fear of people losing their property or their livelihood, not seen since the days of Mao. But, why was he reelected? Wasn't that kind of like the perfect chance if people were really unhappy to get rid of him, or was that just kind of not possible?
I mean, my understanding is that, it's an election, but it's not a popular democratic election, right? It is the members of the party and a particular subset of senior members of the party who decide. And it would have required an awful lot of essentially palace coup type maneuvering to prevent Xi from being reelected. And again, I don't pretend to be a deep expert on Chinese elite politics. But I mean, think in terms of the movie Death of Stalin, right? I mean, until the person who runs the Secret Service and the military is gone, you are a little cautious about taking over. So I wouldn't view his reelection as a mandate or as representing anything. Now, there is some sense, and I've read this from experts, some sense in which even the party, even President Xi, feel some accountability to the general public, And so some of the interpretations about why the zero COVID policy was lifted rather abruptly and quickly after them saying in last November it's going to take a little while to take away was because of protests that actually did occur. And so, I mean, and this again is a general pattern, even in dictatorships, there is some regard for the public. But from the narrow economic point of view that I look at, there's sort of a perverse result. Until things get really bad, you can end up actually having the party or the leadership having more control. Because as things get more desperate and the party gets more arbitrary, it's all the more important to stay on the good side of the local officials. It's all the more important not to be persecuted. And so, for example, this is what we've seen with Erdogan in Turkey. This is what we've seen with Chavez and Maduro in Venezuela. That even when the economy stops performing very well, the people feel like they have to play along because it's scary. So, autocracy means something. The power of the state means something. And so I think there is some limit to how unpopular you can get away with being, but there's a lot of room to run on the economic side.
You've said that Biden's approach to China has been, you described it there a few moments ago as, they're not quite taking advantage of this, but you said that it was less self-harming than those pursued by Trump. How damaging do you think it will be if Trump's reelected in 2024?
I actually am not sure it's that much less self-harming, particularly in the economic sphere. I mean, I think the amount of corruption or the amount of desire for annoying allies or disregard for annoying allies is different. I think some of the goals are different, but fundamentally, the economic policy, the policy towards China has barely changed under Biden and Trump. So, to a first approximation, even though I like one, I don't like the other, let's just say it's continuous. So, I think there's a lot of self-harm out there. There's a whole set of self-harm in terms of the trade war and tariffs narrowly defined and restrictions. That's a whole other discussion. I know you've talked about that with other people in the past. But there's very clear evidence American consumers, meaning American working people, are bearing the burden of this. So we're going back to school, and there's a nice new piece out from the National Taxpayers Union, I think, about how this is going to be the most expensive back to school shopping in years in real terms. And it's partly inflation, but it's mostly the tariffs on goods from China. So there's that there. But then what I'm trying to emphasize more recently in this article and elsewhere is the self-harm of these dynamics where we get into subsidies wars, where if you want to do solar power, or you want to do green investment, but you can't buy batteries and solar pieces from China, then you have to create those industries wholesale at home, which not only leaves the possibility of corruption, is really expensive. So, it's one thing to say, semiconductors, I don't want to be dependent on this particular plant in Taiwan, or I don't want the Chinese military to have access to this. I understand that. But sort of putting your whole economy on an autarky war footing is really expensive. And again, there are things that are more important than money, but really expensive starts to impact those things.
Do you think maybe it's a signal of post the war in Ukraine, the US may be taking not quite an isolationist approach in terms of politics or global politics, but more economically, because we saw how much, especially living in Britain and, how reliant we were on Russian oil and how it kind of woke everyone up to, we really need to be a little bit more independent about how we're getting our energy. Do you think maybe that was kind of what started all of this?
I think it definitely fed it. Because it's a genuine concern on the part of many people, including officials. And we've seen with Germany, for example, which is an even more extreme case in terms of energy dependence. But I think this started long ago. So in an article I wrote a few years ago, 3 years ago now, I think, for Foreign Affairs, I talked about the price of nostalgia. And part of the argument, and there are charts on the Peterson Institute where I work website, is that the U.S. was basically withdrawing from globalization starting around 2000. There's this whole argument that globalization put American workers out of work, did all these terrible things. But the fact is, while the rest of the world was opening up, U.S. was closing down on immigration, on trade deals, on investment, everything. So I think this security aspect, which again, I think is a legitimate concern, has just fed or accelerated this process. You could use the term catalyzed if that's what you want. But it started long ago, and it runs much deeper. So Congress sometimes makes mistakes. We saw that with slavery. We saw that with various things through the years. I'm not saying this is equivalent to slavery in moral terms, but in the sense that you can have something that's a bipartisan agreement, broad consensus that's just totally off base. And I think the Congress, both parties, even more than President Biden, maybe not more than President Trump's administrations, is just incredibly hostile, and to economics, to foreign countries in general, to trade, and to the globalization. And I don't think that serves the American public interest, whatever your national security concerns are.
So if that's the mistake that the U.S. is making in terms of this policy, what should the United States be doing in order to take advantage of China's economic downturn?
Well, let's expand out, Morgan, what you were saying earlier about the UK. So, if the U.S. was not presenting a face that many Chinese people with justification view as hostile, anti-Asian, particularly anti-Chinese, and their COVID, obviously, stories and perceptions and whatever the Chinese government did plays a role. We could be welcoming outward investment from China. We could be welcoming students and scientists from China. We could be encouraging those that are already here to stay instead of encouraging them to leave. We could be encouraging Chinese people to the extent they're allowed, move their savings abroad, and even to the extent they're not allowed, as we saw in Latin America or Russia in the past, people try to get around capital controls. They want to diversify their money. They want to keep it liquid. We could be, as I put it in a little bumper sticker way in the piece, we should be thinking suction, not sanctions on China. And you want to create a dynamic which is beneficial for economic purposes, which saps China's government party, frankly, of some assets, and more importantly, makes them worried that people think about an alternative. People think about, in the economist Albert Hirschman's word, exit, not loyalty. And it's not going to be like the Berlin Wall, but if you can create a dynamic which I think the U.S. could easily, where at the margin there are a lot more people in China, not just the rich tech moguls, who are thinking diversify out of China, produce out of China, get out of China, get some money out of China. That puts pressure on the regime, and better than sanctions does. Because sanctions causes people to rally around the flag and think, oh, the problems we have are the fault of the Americans or the fault of the G7 allies. They're not the fault of our country. Look at what happened in Cuba. Look at what happened in Iran. Whereas if it's suction, then it's everybody, or maybe not everybody, but larger numbers of people are aware, hey, my property, my livelihood would be safer if I was in the U.S. or if I had some stuff outside. So sorry to go on so long, but I think that's the vision. And the one thing I'd say is this isn't fantasy. I mean, in the 30s, facing up against fascist Italy and Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan before the war, in the Cold War, up until the mid-'80s when it became obvious the Soviet Union had real problems economically, that it wasn't clear that the U.S. was way outperforming the USSR. It wasn't clear that the U.S. was way outperforming in the 30s the fascist states. What was clear was that economically people were more unsafe and insecure in these autocratic countries. And so that helped. I mean, you don't want to put a number on it, but you talk about the refugees, go see Oppenheimer. You talk about the huge number of scientific refugees who left Germany. These things matter.
And I mean, do we think there's a risk of China kind of acting out as a result of this economic misfortune? Should we be paying closer attention to Taiwan, or, this might actually lead to China not having the capacity to focus on Taiwan for the foreseeable, maybe providing an opening for the West?
I guess there, Rick Morgan, I'm a little more old school in the following sense, that as much as I talk about economics, and I think it matters, I think ideology and national security actually are pretty independent of economics. Over long periods of time, if you have really bad economics, again, like the Soviet Union, it eventually catches up with you and constrains you. But with regard to Taiwan, that's motivated by deep ideology, senses of national security threat, geographic proximity, long-standing building in the Chinese Navy and military for what they need to potentially successfully contain or, if necessary, invade Taiwan. So I don't think what I'm talking about near-term affects that, frankly. I do think, if God willing, whatever strategic rivalry we have with China is long-lasting, because I'd rather that we're not going to war and we're not killing people, and the status quo in the world may need to be maintained by people on borders, military people on borders, but maintains. I think over time, the economic problems in China will become more and more obvious and more of a constraint on them. But near term, I don't. And the final thing is, and this is again stuff much more in-depth analysts of foreign policy in China know than I do. You raised rightly the demographics in China. And there is a literature out there very clearly showing that if you have a huge bulk of males over females, which China now does, while those men are in a certain age range, you do tend to be a more violent, aggressive country. So I'd worry about that as the driver for short-term conflict much more than the economic stuff I'm talking about. I think recognizing the economic stuff I'm talking about can help the West focus on what the actual threats are and provide a new thought on what the tools are to deal with those threats. But the threats to me are coming from somewhere else.
Well, and I think that's what makes this conflict so complicated and so confusing. It's so multifaceted because you have the national security threat in Taiwan and the militarization we're seeing there, but you also see this kind of like economic tug of war happening. And they're separate and it's multifaceted, but they're also inextricably linked. And it's very weird that we're seeing this kind of, vast, this militarization of the South China Sea and the Taiwan Strait, while, ultimately a lot of these economies that are, allied to the West are also very reliant on China economically. It's a really confusing time.
I think you're right to see it in those multidimensional terms. This is something I think about a lot, talk with colleagues, talk with officials, people around the world a lot. And my take on this is slightly different. And again, this is my belief, but I don't pretend this is absolutely right. I mean, there's a lot of stuff to weigh here. But my belief, my conviction is that the power of these economic ties over countries' decisions is much smaller than we think. There's this tendency right now in the US, I think in the UK, and a lot of the foreign policy elites, as they're called, the blob as it's called, to overestimate in both directions the importance of the economics. I mean, the economics is very important to people's human well-being. The economics is very important to, if you're running a long-scale war, a la World War II, how much good stuff for military you can produce. But, look at Germany and the rest of your Northern Europe in the face of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, right? Putin cuts off the energy very early in the process. Putin made no bones about threatening them. Don't side with Ukraine. In fact, recant the fact that you made so much outreach to Ukraine before now, or I'm going to cut you off. And in the end, the Europeans went ahead. I mean, they may or may not have done as much for Ukraine as some people want or not. I mean, we can talk about that. But ultimately, Putin was directly threatening them with a huge energy shock, a lasting one. And they said, well, in the end, we're not going to do it. And just to go to the other end of the spectrum, there is a lot of concern, rightly, about China has done a lot of lending to developing countries in recent years. Sovereign lending, lending tied to infrastructure projects. There's a famous harbor in Sri Lanka that the Chinese built and then wanted to exert influence and pressure. Anyway, in the end, these things matter, but ultimately, just as countries in Latin America walked away from the U.S. and client countries in the Middle East walked away from the U.S. that invested and had loans, I don't think in the end it's as powerful as people think. And so again, it matters, but as you said, Morgan, it's a multidimensional problem, but I'm actually partly arguing to downgrade the importance of the economics and look more centrally at these other things.
I wanted to ask you, I mean, if China's economic decline is to continue, or even if it doesn't, does it provide a bit of an opening for another country to kind of emerge, to rise above? And who could we see doing so? Maybe, India or Brazil?
Yeah. No, I think in economic terms, which does definitely feed geopolitical terms, I'm just saying downgrade, and I'm not saying it doesn't matter. India is obviously a potentially huge beneficiary here. And there are things about Modi's policies, both economic and domestic treatment of Muslims, that I don't like, but he's playing this hand reasonably well. And there is a great deal of interest and a lot of support from the Biden administration and others, and the Japanese government, for example, and the British government, to move lots of production into India, consider that a form of friendshoring. Indonesia is another country that has strong candidate status already underway to get disproportionate amounts of friendshoring. and advance. Mexico, for all its troubles in various ways, if the U.S., I think, would think about things properly and invest in the relationship, I don't mean money, I mean more broadly, could really benefit. I mean, so there are a number of the large, decently or better run from an economic point of view, decently in terms of property rights in the sense we were talking about vis-a-vis China, that could benefit a lot and rise a lot in this situation. And then there are small economies as different as Vietnam and Singapore, which even though they're in the same region are very different. But small economies are benefited, some of these are benefiting enormously from offshoring of things from China or inshoring from the US and allies, much the way Ireland benefited enormously from its EU membership and investment. So, I mean, there are a bunch of economies that gain, in a sense, at China's expense. And again, if the Biden administration, or more likely in terms of intent, the Trump administration, doubles down at being unattractive to Chinese people, Chinese investments, Chinese businesses, I would hope the rest of the West, the Commonwealth, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, UK, Singapore, India, Western Europe, Korea, with some limitations on tech transfer, is very welcoming to the Chinese and to these Chinese people and Chinese money and Chinese ideas.
I just had one final question for you, Adam, just about maybe another potential way that the West could take advantage of this. I mean, you were talking about Modi, and we all saw kind of how he was received. I mean, the Biden administration they did the whole lot.
Absolutely.
when he came, and there were protests outside, but he got the full treatment. And when I've talked to people about the kind of China-Taiwan conflict, we're seeing a lot of the U.S. kind of mobilize a lot of allies in that region, but China doesn't necessarily have another ally along its coastline, near Taiwan that it could rely upon. But when I've posed that question to people, they've said, India is probably the closest person that, might come to help them if that ever broke out into a conflict. But maybe another way that the West, can kind of take advantage of this is by investing in its relationship with India.
Yeah.
So that if that plays out, that doesn't happen.
Yeah, I basically agree with the thrust of what you're saying, Morgan. I don't want to. I've held forth a lot on this podcast or recording, and I'm grateful to you giving me time here on Times Radio. But I don't know enough about the Indian foreign policy situation. There's some interesting writings. There's a very lively debate in Washington, and I believe an equally lively debate in Delhi, about how reliable the U.S. should think about India being as a military ally in a China conflict. And I think it's a topic that people have to be thinking about, but I don't pretend to know what the right thing to think is.
That's everything from me for today. Thank you so much to Adam. He's the president of the Peterson Institute for International Economics. If you want to hear more full-length, long discussions about global policy, geopolitics, the war in Ukraine, China, all of the above, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. It helps a lot, and it helps us bring you more and more discussions like this. That's all from me today. Thank you so much for tuning in. Bye.